I'm joined by Mike Moughan this evening to discuss a couple of topics. How are you, Mike?
Good, thanks, Shane. How about yourself?
Yeah, I'm great. It's been a long day, but I'm always look forward to these little sessions. So we've got a couple of topics. First of all, we're going to discuss the, excuse me, the ruling in the Frucor IRD case. And then we've got a much more light-hearted topic involving a friend of mine and a sort of overly publicised sporting controversy from a week or so ago. So without further ado, let's kick off topic one, which is a much more niggly, complex commercial topic, which is the Frucor and IRD ruling in the Court of Appeal last week. So as a start point in layman's or simple terms, that decision regarded the treatment of a $204 million payment from Frucor, between Frucor and their parent, and the treatment of that payment as either an equity subscription for shares in the company or a loan. And the key determination had about a $20 million difference from a tax perspective for Frucor, so it was certainly worth arguing, and indeed it was some 18 years after the alleged tax avoidance took place that we've now seen a Court of Appeal decision. So that's, I think, enough lead from me. And Mike, do you want to just talk a little bit about the case, and then we'll get on to what it means or what it could mean?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, there was a series of quite complex inter-party transactions between related parties. So I don't think, it would be super helpful to go into the sort of minutiae of what those were. But the gist of it is that there was something of a money go-round. So money was loaned to the New Zealand company, Frucor, and that money sort of went around back to the parent company of the New Zealand company in Singapore. And so, it allowed the New Zealand company to claim tax, claim losses against tax for all of the interest payments. But the IRD was of the opinion that, in effect, the whole scheme served no real commercial purpose other than to avoid tax. And in reality, the payment made was not just interest, but principal as well. So that's sort of the gist of what happened.
So yeah. The High Court tended to err or direct itself towards the opinion that, broadly speaking, if there were viable commercial explanations for the transaction to be structured in the way it was, and that happened to have an incidental tax benefit, then that was okay. And they focused on at the entity at a singular or New Zealand level as opposed to the group level. And the Court of Appeal seems to have gone the other way and said that the particular arrangements in question were a contrivance. And I don't think it helped Frucor too much that the exact amount of interest payments they tried to claim based on the $204 million amount happened to be the exact amount that was borrowed from Deutsche Bank, being principal and interest. And one particularly interesting section of the Court of Appeal judgment was the evidence adduced by the commissioner, a professor, I forget his exact name, saying that ordinarily, at its essence, a convertible note is a way for an investor to lend money to a potential entrepreneurial venture and to then later be able to either recover at a commercial rate, a reasonable commercial rate, the investment, so the loan plus interest, or to take the upside if the company performs as well as or better than perhaps represented by the company seeking assistance in the first place to grow. And in his respected professional academic opinion, this structure did not resemble that for a couple of reasons. First of all, that it was the parent that was actually loaning this money. And second of all, that the conversion was at a pre-agreed, very precise price. And they also weren't helped by some of the evidence adduced whereby Deutsche Bank had apparently, according to the judgment, recruited this targets, so to speak, for several of these type of arrangements worldwide, where the first and foremost thing that was determined before the entity being Frucor decided to go ahead was that whether or not they, in the opinion of their advisors, legal and obviously tax advisors, accountants, would they qualify for these tax benefits as they explain them to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Deutsche Bank really only acted as an intermediary. I recall that in the judgment that the court, seemed to find it relevant that Deutsche Bank had no real business interest in acquiring the shares, that they were only acting as an intermediary and passing them on, and only gaining value through the fees. And so
they also had no risk because they were guaranteed by the parent in terms of their obligations.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes. And even the High Court was of the view that the structure was very unorthodox. So that was...
The High Court did find that, but they also didn't find that determinative in that necessarily making it a contrivance.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Court of Appeal tended to go more in the direction of viewing all the arrangements as a whole and saying that it was not something... I think they took a more logical approach to say that what is really speaking, everyone's familiar with the Wolf of Wall Street movie, and if you've read the books, you'll know that Jordan Belfort was all about the concept of plausible deniability. However, put this scheme together, and in terms of the paper trail, they weren't following Jordan Belfort's notorious lack of paperwork and efforts to cover, and of course they weren't, not suggesting for a moment they were fraudulent or targeting pump and dumps, propagating pump and dump schemes, but the evidence does suggest that there was, first and foremost in their minds, an intention to gain tax benefits. In fact, the evidence adduced in the judgment does suggest that.
There was an asymmetry there that I didn't really quite come to a view on, but possibly you did. I noted that in the sort of latter half of the judgment, the Court of Appeal dealt with submissions from Frucor's lawyers to the effect that the parent company was like the tax that they, I think it was, had they structured the arrangement differently, they would have ended up, encountering the tax liability elsewhere anyway. And the Court of Appeal looked at the whole thing as a group when it came to sort of answering this question of whether anything was evaded. But then when they dealt with those counter arguments, they treated the company in isolation. So it was like they were treating it as a group first analysis, but then in the second, they with reference to the tax laws, said that what happens offshore and in other parts of the wider group structure really isn't relevant. Did you come to follow any of that part of it and give it thought?
I did, and I read it for the purposes of having this obviously general discussion, and I, for the life of me, couldn't actually tell you, or haven't yet figured out how exactly. There seem to be inconsistencies just generally, though. I mean, the fact that the High Court found almost overwhelmingly in favour of Frucor on almost all of the factors the court determined had to be met under that section of the Income Tax Act, and then almost, for want of a better term, the Court of Appeal almost blew them out of the water in terms of denouncing kind of the other than the very first question of whether or not it was in the allowed or the prescribed activities of the section, which everyone agreed on. After that, they went completely different directions in terms of whether there was a contrivance, or whether you had to consider the different structures, or whether you considered the commercial viability, whether you could consider that against other similar structures or commercial viabilities, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, at a sort of...
Sorry, we're having a bit of...
At a higher level, I guess it's an interesting case beyond kind of practitioners who are interested in the details of these sort of things, just because, you know, there's a public awareness that companies, multinationals, structure their affairs in these sorts of ways to avoid tax liability, and it's quite a good example of it. And obviously,
we're dealing with a couple of files at the moment that there are convertible notes at play, and it's not for 200 million, as you appreciate, us being a smaller firm. But I mean, for these clients that we're dealing with, and that's not the issue we've been instructed in respect of, and thankfully there's nothing at play there at the moment in that regard. But even if at these, albeit smaller yet considerable amounts, in terms of viewed in the abstract, still a lot of money to anyone, even wealthy people, there is a real consequence here that parties need to turn their mind to when they are structuring their affairs.
Yeah, I thought that actually, you know, the things that are novel to the case kind of concern principles that will be largely irrelevant to all but very large companies with intergroup structures. But the case goes over a lot of the orthodox principles around tax avoidance that are more broadly relevant. And particularly today's news that the Labour government is going to be increasing the top marginal tax rate for the wealthy, for people over 180k, which is coincidentally, I note, the maximum salary for most MPs. So it's an interesting point to draw the line. But, you know, before that...
What are you trying to say?
I'm just making an observation, like Mr. Brownlee. You know, nothing beyond that, Shane. But, you know, it's probably the case that for those people whose marginal tax rate's going up, a lot of them who may at 33 cents on the dollar have, you know, just decided largely to wear it, may be wanting to look more closely at how they can structure their affairs to avoid having to pay more tax than they need to. And that's where the principles of this case are quite relevant, because, you know, it sets out that even if individual transactions in a kind of arrangement are all lawful in terms of the various tax legislation, if the purpose or effect of the arrangements as a whole was to avoid tax, even if that's just one of the purposes, then that's tax avoidance. And, you know, what you need to be able to ensure is that there's a good argument that the tax you avoid was merely incidental, which is to say that it was kind of an unavoidable minor consequence, that there was some strong commercial or economic reason to do it the way that you did it.
I agree. I mean, I read an article from one of the big four accounting firms, and I can't remember who it was from, and it was reasonably compelling reading. But then after reading this guy's view was that it was a dark day for commerciality, for want of a better word, in New Zealand, because it's really taken an approach where the authority has almost sort of putative, almost, how do I put it? They just have an all-encompassing ability to denounce any kind of structure as tax evasion, and that accordingly it's going to discourage economic activity or foreign direct investment in New Zealand because of the that perception. But after reading the judgment, I have to say, because of a couple of reasons, I don't know if I agree with that. And that is because, first of all, the judgment set out that neither party contested the view that, except for, quote, a doomsday event, the shares were going to, that the conversion was going to take place. Second of all, the evidence of the professor, which I've got to say, not leaning towards either Frucor or IRD, and no one wants to lean towards IRD, let's be honest, but just reading it in the abstract, it was really cogent because it set out the real usual basis. And I have to agree, I've only ever come across a convertible note in the circumstances I explained earlier when you're looking to invest and also take a potential upside. Now, it didn't have that flavour to it when you read all the evidence. Then you read the stuff about Deutsche Bank, and then you think about the fact it was only going to be called on in that circumstance. When I think about all of that together, I've got to say I can see how the Court of Appeal reached that decision. But that's not to say that other convertible note structures or attempts to actually obtain that effect, in my view, wouldn't necessarily would fall short of the courts in the same way, because those are really compelling factors that I just outlined. I don't think it's necessarily as bad for incentivizing investment, perhaps, as this article I read initially sets out.
Yeah, well, certainly, if it's an arm's length investor on the other side of the convertible note, then it's hard to see how that would really trigger any of the analysis in this case. It also suggests...
One good point, Mike, that I read, sorry to cut you off there, just so I'll forget it otherwise.
Right.
The Court of Appeal, the High Court did give some countenance to the fact that it wasn't a costless exercise for Frucor, in the sense that they did have to pay for that loan by issuing shares, because they were of value. Even anything above par value would be of value to the parent, and therefore, if you look at it on a singular or an entity basis as opposed to a group or transporter basis, the fact that there is value means that it was actually a cost. So for the Court of Appeal, later came in and said actually they agreed with the Commission's submissions, or their lawyers' submissions, that says there was actually no cost because the shares were just exchanged. That doesn't feel right. But then when you lay out the fact that it was the parent and then all the other stuff, if you have to, some of these things are kind of like flipping a coin, obviously, by the fact that some really, bright minds in the High Court went quite strongly one way and the Court of Appeal the other. But I'm more interested in the decision from a mechanical point of view in terms of the law and how the law operates. And the reason we do these quite neat little sessions is to try and disseminate some of this information, explain to people a bit more the next time, hopefully, that they hear the words convertible note or tax evasion, they get a bit more of an idea of how the courts come to these decisions. And I just enjoy it. I think it's fun. But maybe I'm a sort of sixth sense of fun, but I find it quite fun.
The fact that arm's length investor situations wouldn't trigger this sort of analysis, I think would mean I'd agree with you that this is probably quite unlikely to significantly, have a real dampening effect on how people invest here. Though I note that the judgment pointed out these kind of intergroup transactions are quite common and a quite common part of, and often for legitimate reasons too. It made me wonder as well, how one might try and achieve what Frucor was trying to achieve in future in light of this decision. One thing would obviously be to do more in the way of documentation and so forth to make it look more legitimate. As you pointed out, having the value of the convertible note and the loan equate to each other was probably, a little bit of a mistake. And also, there are ways to structure companies to provide the appearance of arm's length when, of course, none really exists. We both have you encountered much of that professionally?
I haven't acted on that many very big transactions, so that's the honest answer to that. So
like,
I'm
it's not
informed as people watching, to be honest.
I mean, I haven't been involved in anything like that either, but I have a friend who about 3 years ago moved to some island in the Caribbean, and that's all he does is set up these companies that are, any attempt to find out ownership just leads back to a law firm in the Caribbean. And of course, the ultimate owner of the company has some agreement in their drawer somewhere. So I suppose there are structures like that it
doesn't work for what was it called? Fonseca? Was that the name of the company?
Yeah, that big data breach was
the
one
book. I've read the book. What was the book called?
I
forget the name of it, but there was a guy down in Queen Street. Man, I went and had a look after I read the book, and it was incredible. He had office and he was banging these things out and billing them for like $7 or $8 grand for a basic trust deed and setting up a corporate trustee company. And it doesn't even sound like he documented things properly. He just created these deeds. And I think one year he made nearly $1 million. And it's just this stupid, like crappy, like well, those offices on Queen Street where they have the massively long staircase. So he obviously just there every day, and he had this lady creating these trust deeds and building these assets all throughout the world and making a fortune from taking on a disproportionate amount of risk.
New Zealand, I don't know if it still is up to the present date, but certainly like when I last had anything to do with this kind of work, which was probably 3 or 4 years ago, I know it was a very attractive place for people to set up companies for various reasons because of the ease of doing it. And, I think a level of regulatory oversight that means that, you could set something up that other people around the world would treat as more bona fide than if if it was coming from Panama or the like. I can't recall the exact details. I wish I could, but there's something around all our FMA stuff, I think, where you can, there's some kind of status you can get that's much less onerous than really being, properly examined and regulated, but it has the kind of appearance of it, or that people that don't know enough about our law confuse one with the other. It's like, we in a previous life I did some work where we had Russian clients who were setting companies up here for forex exchange type business, and there was quite a lot of regulatory tension around that, but that was why they were doing it.
Yeah. As soon as you get involved with we're doing a few things at the moment with overseas persons in terms of the OIA and various having various AML issues, and obviously the extent that the DIA would go to make an example of someone who was clearly not turning their mind to compliance around AML, OIO, any of that sort of stuff is quite scary, and it needs thorough input. Otherwise, we're going to fall foul of the regulators. We've just had a question come in from Sam McDonald, the former Labour MP candidate for I think Sam, where was it? It was somewhere out in East Auckland. But he said, any thoughts on the disqualification? Now, a friend and I were talking about this morning, and we reckon that I've just got, our mystery guest has just made his appearance. I think we're going to add him to this. Robbie, welcome. How are you?
Hello.
Can you hear us?
Hello, Robbie.
Yeah, I can hear you.
We've only got a very narrow on our button. There you go. So you've made quite a timely appearance there, Robbie, because one of our kind of committed long-term supporters of the channel, one of about 7 or 8, Sam McDonald, the former National Party MP candidate for the East Auckland electorate, has raised the question that do we have any thoughts on the Djokovic disqualification? Mike, my initial thought was because they don't have ACC over there, why wouldn't this woman, if you're looking at it from a cynical point of view, why wouldn't she milk it for as much as she could? Because he's probably just going to get sick of all the bullshit that comes with it and go, oh, look, here's $500,000 just to fuck off. What do you think?
Well, I thought about when I saw the Djokovic news, knowing that we were going to do this, obviously there are some interesting parallels. And I looked a little bit around why he was disqualified, and there's obviously the idea that you can't be, it's unsportsmanlike behavior and something to do with abusing your balls. Apparently, abusing your balls is a terrible thing. And, I thought, I sort of expressed a view last week that really, in terms of preserving the integrity of sport, you don't want to be disqualifying people from a competition unless, generally speaking, unless what they're doing, has some effect on their likely performance. Obviously all the anti-doping stuff, cheating, anything where, what they're doing is likely to mean that they're going to have an advantage over other participants. But once you start disqualifying people for things that go wider than that, in my view, that kind of tarnishes the competitiveness of it a little bit and also is somewhat open to abuse. But I think the Djokovic thing, to me, it's borderline. On the one hand, it was unsportsmanly, I guess, and he injured someone, but it was quite arbitrary. The person was 40 feet away. Tennis is famous for people throwing little hissy fits. It's virtually a part of that particular sport. And, I think particularly given the prominence of the guy, the fact that he's a real contender to be one of the, is already one of the better tennis players ever, and is sort of, on the heels of Federer and Nadal, I thought it was a little rough.
We've got another prominent athlete joining us tonight, Robbie Johnson from Otago. Good evening, Robbie.
How are you, Shane?
Good to have you on the feed. You were on the AM show last week as well. And for those of you who don't know the story, Robbie was a two-time Olympian, 92 and 96 in the 5 and 10,000. And he's been a fantastic athlete for New Zealand for a number of years. He ran, I think, was it 27 minutes and 42 seconds, just missing the national record for the 10,000 meters. And was it 96, Robbie, you did that time?
Yeah, 96.
Yep. And he ran a 2:15 marathon, which was a little bit below what quite a few of the pundits in the New Zealand athletics community hoped for from Robbie, but still nonetheless a fantastic run out over in London. But he's probably achieved more fame, or maybe a better word is notoriety, for his achievements for being disqualified for spitting during the recent New Zealand allegedly spitting. So do you want to talk us through, Robbie, what happened?
Well, I guess I was doing this event here in Dunedin, which was supposed to be the New National Cross Country Champs, but because of Auckland lockdown, Aucklanders couldn't come down. They downgraded it to a sort of like a challenge, cross-country challenge was the sort of the term. And so to sort of fulfill, I guess, level 2 requirements, they had to come up with some, new rules, in inverted commas, I guess. So not allowed to have, groups of more than 100. So making sure there weren't more than 100 in any one event. So-called, I guess, social distancing and various other things. And one such rule, in inverted commas, was that if you were deemed to be spitting in an offensive manner, you could be disqualified. Well, as luck would have it, supposedly I was deemed to be spitting twice, I guess in an offensive manner, and was disqualified. So basically, when I finished doing the event, some official came up and said, "Oh, you've been seen spitting twice, and you're disqualified." And I said, "Oh, okay, yeah, that's a bit of a oh yeah, I just thought it was a bit of a joke, to be fair." And but at that sort of finish area, there was a reporter there, and who happened to mention it on. He was doing a sports comment on something like Country Gold FM or something, and he mentioned at the end of the sports comment that he makes every Monday morning, and somebody from Stuff happened to be driving to work at that time and heard it and tracked me down. I think they tracked me down via Facebook, and contacted me and asked for a few comments, and they did a sort of report, and it was on the Stuff website. I think it was on the front page there, and then I think from that, the ODT, the local newspaper, sort of ran the same sort of thing, and then TV3 AM show contacted me because they'd seen that, and then a couple of other radio stations, and it all went, I guess, with the whole COVID thing, and people think, oh, this is just, getting a bit crazy. So yeah, that's all sort of what developed, really.
It seems to me absurd that you could they sanction the event, call it whatever you like, it's just a handle or a label, but they sanction the event, and which is great. And and this isn't designed in any way to hate on or to criticise Athletics New Zealand or the local federation that sanctioned the race, because it's great that I believe, in my personal view, that we get out there and we try and do things which give people some meaning in their life and some sense of normalcy, and focus on, obviously, like people like yourself, Robbie, who are really good at something to do and to have some community around it. It just does seem a little bit absurd to me that you could sanction that event knowing full well that things like that happen in a knee-jerk kind of way, even if we assume for the sake of the point of making that you did spit. Like you pointed out on the AM show, Roger Tuivasa-Sheck was having a few hoiks after scoring a try. Again, that's probably, for Roger in your case, 20, 30 years of habit after scoring a try, or maybe being in the back paddock of the national cross-country champs spitting. It just seems to me absurd that you're going to say you guys can all get together and race and compete and then try and bring that kind of rule in. Or maybe I'm missing.
They had, a couple of pages, I guess, of new rules, so to speak, around level 2, and that was one of them. But other ones were all officials were going to be wearing face masks and gloves. Well, I would say there would have been a couple at that wearing face masks, and that everybody was going to be socially distanced, and so there's people around the course, but there wasn't any sort of policing of that, I guess, or even at the finish line, which was a little area, so people, in various states of sort of, fatigue, lying on the ground and sweat and all that, and one little area, and on the info sheet it said, as soon as you finish it, everybody was sort of marched, supposed to be away, so that no one was sort of congregating, and that didn't sort of happen. I guess also, and subsequently, I was the only one to be disqualified, so apparently I was the only one spitting all day out of 300 plus people. But also, the fact that I didn't have any recourse to appeal that. They just said basically that was it, on your bike. So I had no recourse to sort of say, well, okay, who saw me? Where did this happen, etc. Yeah, so I had no, like, apparently found out later that you were supposed to get a warning, and I never had any warning. I was just told at the end, oh, you've been seen spitting twice, you're out. So it's like, it's all set for me that, okay, yeah, here's level 2 COVID restrictions. It's, we've come up with this sort of bureaucratic plan. We've got to implement something, which they only implemented, some of their overall kind of plan. And I'm the one who sort of bore the brunt of their sort of officiousness, I guess.
I think that we've seen it in the commercial space in terms of throwing out a whole different set of parameters or considerations. And the law sometimes has to scramble to keep up, because that's what the law is, after all. It's a body of rules designed to try and effect the most number of good outcomes in the most number of cases, if that makes sense. And COVID is really, like, before COVID, this would never be a thing. Like, imposing these public health rules into a sporting event, and it's sort of given the bureaucrats a lot of rope, so to speak, or a lot of license to legislate. I use the term somewhat mockingly, and introduce rules with no real checks or balances on the sort of basis for them or how they're policed. I mean, you're not Robbie, you're 53 years old and you're the Masters National Cross Country Challenge champion. You're probably unlikely to get your legal team to institute a challenge on the Court of Arbitration of Sport. But having said that, it's just quite an interesting kind of topic, or that's obviously why you're on the AM show, and it captured the sort of imagination of people saying, what has this COVID done to our society? And this is quite an almost comical kind of fallout.
Yeah.
Mike, you had some good comments last week around the whole convergence of public health legislation and rules of competition, and how it's almost impossible to impose any kind of rules that really fits within that sort of weird juncture between the two.
Yeah, well, I mean, and subsequent to that, Shane, you sent me through the Athletics New Zealand information sheet that I believe was given to you, Robbie, ahead of the competition. And I was really quite surprised by how incoherent it was. Like, what on earth do they mean by spitting in an offensive manner? Like, if this is some sort of prohibition aimed at public health, what on earth does offence have to do with it? Surely it's bad if you're compromising public health in an inoffensive way. Like, I really don't understand. It seems like a very strange analysis to take to it. And then, I noted it was quite reasonably indeterminate. Could be disqualified, not shall be disqualified. Deemed to be, offensive is obviously a pretty vague kind of standard. I mean, what constitutes offence? I would have thought, I'd be offended if someone spat at me. I don't think if I was running a cross country, and I'm not a super athletic guy, but I know enough to know that, when you exert yourself heavily, like, voiding things from your mouth or nose in the process is not, it's something very likely to occur, I would have thought. It would be a hard thing. I would have thought it may be a hard thing not to do at some point. Robbie, you might have a view on that. Is like over a long cross country race.
Yeah, I guess it's something until now I've never really thought about. Yeah, you may, like, I don't remember spitting. Maybe I did, but it's not something that generally sort of thinking about too much. So yeah, I guess sometimes your nasal passages, might get a bit of mucusy or something, but you might clear so I guess it's a relatively common sort of thing. But over essentially like a golf course, it was a golf course, over an 8K sort of course, you're quite spread, and basically this course is right by the beach, so it's quite a windswept sort of area. So it's not like, even if you were spitting, that you'd be, if you were just sort of randomly spitting on the ground, anything really too consequential. I guess as I read it, if spitting in a defensive manner, it would be spitting at someone or on someone while you're running alongside them or something. And I don't think certainly any of that stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
Robbie, has the whole controversy though had a somewhat positive side effect that it's drummed up a bit of local support for your shoe clinic business?
I did have must have been a couple of days after it was in the paper here, I think, and it was just a customer. He was just randomly talking about the world, and he said, "Oh, yeah, it's going crazy. Some guy got disqualified for spitting in a running event," and I just said, "Yeah, that was me." And then another person come in, they'd seen me on TV. "Oh, you're that guy that was on TV yesterday morning," and they say, "Oh, how crazy it is, all this." So I guess most of the people have picked up on it, just thinking, "Oh, the world's sort of going crazy, that things are coming to that someone's getting kicked out of a race, not for drugs or anything, but for maybe having a spit and deeming it to be offensive, I guess."
It's quite funny because normally with these sort of things, you might get 50-50 or 70-30 or 90-10, but I, haven't heard of I text my mum and I said, because obviously my mum and dad know Robbie pretty well, and we've known each other for 20 plus years now, and mum said, mum can be, how would I put it? She likes to play devil's advocate, and she said, "Oh, it's absolutely bloody ridiculous," in her text message back. And I imagine that would be the sentiment of almost everybody. I can't think of anyone. If anyone actually thinks it's offensive, maybe make a comment in the post in the comment section now and speak up. And so Robbie and Mike and I can entertain that the sentiment.
Spammed by a few people sort of who must have found me on Facebook, and sort of they weren't friends of mine or anything, messaging like articles about COVID and all this, like these random people.
Really?
COVID never goes away. Some people saying, "Oh, spitting is disgusting," and all this. I did get it, but equal one person, "You're very handsome," and all that. So yeah, I did get a few people sort of trying to make contact along those lines.
The very popular running website in the US, letsrun.com, which I know Robbie and I have been frequenters of for many years. It's a great website about the sort of athletics world. They featured you, Robbie. I think you were the first New Zealander since Nick Willis, who's been featured there multiple times, to make a quote of the day. That's pretty cool. So you've put the New Zealand athletics community back in the limelight, probably not for the right reasons, and you're probably going to go down as maybe, I don't know if a martyr is the right word, but certainly a controversial figure.
Well, Roger Robinson, he had written an article along about it as well, and he sort of was somebody from Boston or somewhere, a historian, that he had sort of liaised with, and he thought I might be the first person in the history of running events to be disqualified for spitting in an event. But those Let's Run guys, so they'd picked up that article, and I think it was just in the general message thing, and I saw it, and because I think it was one of the founders, Robert Johnson, and he was sort of asking about any more info, how this happened. And so I just emailed him that link from the AM show, because that gave it a good sort of background and that. But interesting, he emailed me back because he was asking, he thought, New Zealand was all COVID free, and that you were basically either in lockdown or it was normal life. And he was sort of trying to understand, how we were in sort of semi lockdown in some of the country, I guess, and how they could impose these sort of rules. That because he was it's either black or white. You're either locked down or you're not. And he was sort of under the impression that New Zealand was just, all tickety-boo, basically. So, and that's when he, basically ended up being on the front page of it and making a bit of a talking board of it, I guess.
I heard that Cal Jackson had something to do with the dissemination of that information to Let's Run. That's what my sources tell me.
Yeah, yeah.
And apparently he was hanging out with the bread man this morning. That's the official word.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
All right. So thanks for coming on, Robbie and Mike. And it was a to use a horrific rugby analogy, a game of two halves. We had Frucor versus the IRD, and then we had Athletics New Zealand versus Johnson, and two quite different rulings. But in both cases, I don't know whether justice was done, but time will tell. Robbie, if you want to take the case to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, Mike is a pro litigator. Richard Swan's asked what a fee estimate would be, so I'll have to let you guys negotiate that off air afterwards. But I'm thinking around about the $5 to $10,000 mark, Mike, would probably be a fair fee for Robbie to get his dignity back.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I didn't hear the last bit of that, Shane.
I'm saying about $5 or $6,000 possibly would be a good fee for Robbie to recover his dignity at the expense of Athletics New Zealand.
Yeah, I looked a little bit at that. Did you think about, Robbie, any means of appeal?
No, but on the sort of similar stream to that, I've one radio station that got hold of me. I won't say where, but somebody gave out my number of where they could contact me, which I thought, gee, that's a bit rank. So they given out my number. So this was an official organisation who were trying to track me down. So they said, oh, here, you can contact them at this place and da-da-da-da-da. So I thought, yeah, it didn't worry me, but I thought, yeah, that's pushing the envelope a bit as well.
Mm-hmm.
Offensive contact.
But, like they're kind of not respecting my privacy. Yeah, the radio guy, he could have tracked me down easily enough. But the fact that somehow they just decided they didn't want to make any comment. Oh, but here's his number, you can contact him.
This is Athletics New Zealand handed over your contact details.
And I'm not going to say who I did, but yeah. Yeah, so I thought that was a bit average.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
I looked for this at their competition rules, and I saw some reference to judicial regulations for disputes of this nature, but it was very hard, obviously with limited time before coming on tonight, to really pin down what the process is or where you go if you have a dispute about something of this nature.
Yeah, well, I think there wasn't really, they didn't have any sort of process in place if you were going to be disputing it. So it was basically, that was it. Because like within, let's say, half an hour of the event, they're presenting the awards and results are posted and it's all signed, sealed and delivered. So you only had that little window to make any sort of appeal, but there was no means of appealing. That was just it. Like, so at the time, like, I guess, it's not the biggest event in the world, so I don't know, whatever. But if it's been something, when I think about later, if it's been some big event or, if it's, say, somebody else and it was a big national champs, that, you'd be pretty hard done by.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, okay, Athletics New Zealand, they may have some other events coming up. Are these going to be the same sort of rules in place and how are they going to apply? Like, are they going to have people policing that as well? Looking for people spitting. They're going to warn people. What the means of appealing, that sort of stuff. So I guess it'll be interesting in that respect to see what happens, how they sort of apply it.
What Shane said earlier, that law, sort of has to play catch up sometimes with events. It's probably unsurprising that as we kind of come to terms with how to integrate the response to COVID into everything, that there'll be things that aren't done as well as they could have been. it might be, worthwhile, Robbie, sharing with Athletics New Zealand, some suggestions with respect to future sporting events. I mean, the one that occurs to me as the most obvious is that when something's going to have quite a significant repercussion, like disqualification, that should be explicit in the rule. It shouldn't be a matter of discretion. We might do this. Like, if everyone knew that was an inevitable consequence of spitting, then I imagine people would be much more mindful of it. I mean, I doubt that was on anyone's minds at all in the race that you ran.
No, definitely.
And like Robbie said, in terms of applying it as a principled basis as opposed to specific to the circumstances, or say his specific circumstances, you imagine if it happened in an Olympic final, Olympic 50-meter final. There's millions of dollars of people's future on the line, medals, national pride, all of that. It's just if the same rule did apply universally, I think the sport would have major problems, or any sport would have major problems.
Yeah, I think they may well have come up with their sort of 2-page document in the last sort of week or so, thinking, we've got to tick off the boxes and da-di-da-di-da. But I think how they applied some of it was probably not quite as robust as it could have been. And then, is it really worth disqualifying someone because you think they might have spat a couple of times? Yeah, it was open to a bit of conjecture, but cheapers, it's going a bit overkill. It could have sort of.
I think it's probably like a lot of stuff's been done, and it's certainly in much more serious areas than this, has been done with the best of intentions, but probably not completely thought through, and they're probably not resourced to think all that through, like say we are trained to do when Parliament is trained to do when they make the whole lawmaking process. It's not exactly a select committee, I imagine, sitting there going, okay, well, we thought about the flow-on effect of making this decision. What about the rights of the individual to actually, advocate for themselves in terms of whether a fair process was followed? And, it's without wanting to be overly, lambasting them, because I don't think they deserve that either. It's just an interesting discussion to have, because it is a new world we live in at the moment. Well, it's a new world at the moment anyway. It goes away. But I mean, over time, It
was just a perfect storm of events really that happened to, that they had these sort of rules in place, and that I happened to be the one and the reporter, he knew who I was days gone by, and just thought it was an interesting tidbit. And then I guess it's the whole COVID sort of world, and I think even like the TV3 guys, that they're kind of looking for a bit of a light-hearted angle on the COVID, because it's all kind of doom and gloom in many respects. So it just sort of fell into that sort of space at that time, really. Because I think when I was TV3, they lined me up to be on after Chris Hipkins was talking about, some health, things and that. So they wanted a bit of levity to lighten the mood in the morning.
So you were kind of like when Hendricks first went over to the UK, you were a bit like him, following on what's his face? Who was the guy that around that era with Springsteen? I forget now the performer, but you were like after Hipkins, so he was your warm-up act. Eric Clapton, that was it. Eric Clapton was petrified by that. Yeah, Hendricks was he was following him on. So you're a bit like him.
Yeah.
Bobby Hendricks.
Yeah.
Very good. I don't think I've got nothing more to add. Mike, do you have anything more to add?
No, I don't, Shane.
I've got a whole lot of noise, Robbie, coming out of the cheap seats from some delinquents that we've fraternised with at times over the years. But this is obviously a very serious forum, and we don't want to give any oxygen to these delinquents. So I think we'll wrap without giving them any satisfaction, if it's all right with you.
that's all good with me. Thanks, Shane.
All right,
Thanks,
guys.
Mike.
Thanks very much for coming on. It was good fun.
Thanks, Robbie.
Cheers.
Mm.
Okay, stay up.
Nice. Bye.